And welcome to our second class of our Healthy Florida Lifestyle series, which is going to be going on for the next couple of weeks here in April. This session is going to be from Farm to Table, Florida Agriculture, and it'll be presented by Morgan Pinkerton, who is our Sustainable Agriculture Agent here at UF-IFAS Extension Seminole County. For today's class, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box, which you'll see on either the top or bottom of your screen as something that you can click on. We have disabled the chat box for today, so your questions should go in the Q&A. And if you like, you can also press the raise hand button, and if we have time, we'll unmute you and you can ask your question verbally as well. So again, this is part of our Grow Your Healthy Florida Lifestyle series. We are meeting Tuesdays from noon to 1 p.m. from April 6th to the 27th. So you can catch next week. We'll be going over growing gardens here in Central Florida, and our final week will be kind of summarizing everything that we've covered over the last couple of weeks and giving you some ideas of things that you can change quickly in your own lives to grow your healthy Florida lifestyle. But for today, we're doing From Farm to Table, Florida Agriculture. So your presenters throughout this series, last week we had Sharon Gam, who is our worksite wellness and fitness coach here in Seminole County. I'm Katie McCormick, the residential horticulture agent and Master Gardener volunteer coordinator. And I'll be joined by Tina McIntyre, our Florida Friendly Landscaping agent, next week to talk about growing in our Florida gardens. And this week in particular, we have Dr. Morgan Pinkerton, who is our Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Agent, going to be talking to you about farm to table agriculture in Seminole County. So what is Extension? Extension is a partnership between federal, state, and local government with the roles of communicating science-based information to the local community and communicating the needs of the community to the scientists. So what we are is science educators. We teach you, our community, about all the information that's coming out of the university system and how best to work in your gardens or manage your finances or farm. And then we also take the questions that you have and bring them to the scientists at UF and say, these are common questions in our community. Is there research on this? Or could you do some research on it? So we're your best connection to the University of Florida here in the state of Florida. And with that, I'll hand you guys over to Morgan.
Alrighty, let me go ahead and gain control of the presentation again here. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. We are going to be getting into the topic of agriculture, and we're going to approach this from looking at it from the farm to your table and your plates at home. So to start off, I want to ask you guys a question. When you first hear the word agriculture, what pops into your head? So go ahead and put that answer into the Q&A. I'm just curious to see what everyone's first thought of the word agriculture is. Interesting. So we have a couple people saying farming, some people saying crops. Someone said farming for food. Someone said farming and homegrown. So these are all really good ideas here. What else do we have? We have someone saying groceries. Okay, so that's a little bit different than what everyone else is saying, and that's good because we're going to be talking a little bit about the grocery sides of farming too. And animals. Animals are also included in that agriculture when we think of livestock. We have some people saying fresh veggies when they think of the word agriculture. So good. Let's see if we get any more responses here for a second. And I'm just trying to gauge what your first idea of agriculture is, because sometimes it's very different from what agriculture actually is. So we have an idea, it's like farming, it's groceries, it relates to our food in some way, livestock, but really, what is it? So we'll get into talking about that here today. So I do want to start off with the definition of agriculture so that we're all on the same page here. The word agriculture, it's derived from the Latin word agricultura, and ager means in the field and cultura means cultivation. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, that definition is the science, the art, or practice of cultivating the soil, producing crops, and raising livestock, and in varying degrees, the preparation and marketing of the resulting products. And this definition may seem pretty straightforward. It kind of just revolves around our food and how food comes to be and how we get it to our table. But this definition barely scrapes the surface of just how complex our agricultural systems are. Before we talk more about our agriculture system, I just want to give you an overview of our agriculture here in Florida. Agriculture is our second largest industry. So many of you may know that we are very, very well known for tourism in the state of Florida, but we're also very well known for our agriculture. Our industry is valued at over $7.35 billion every year. So it brings in a lot of money, it provides a lot of jobs, and it really helps our economy here in the state. Florida is number one in the production of a lot of different commodities. So we're number one in the US for oranges, tomatoes, watermelon, grapefruit, snap beans, and a few others. And we're also second in the production of peppers, strawberries, sweet corn, and many more. So how is this all possible? Well, Florida has a very unique geographic area. So many of you have traveled and come to Florida for the reason that our climate is really nice, and it's nice all year long. So many people end up in the state of Florida because throughout the year, there are very mild winters. We have very nice summers. It's sunny most of the time. We get really good weather. This weather is also really good for growing plants. So we don't have a lot of harsh freezes, especially in the central to southern parts of Florida, that would normally make growing produce in certain times of the year difficult in other parts of the US. But one thing we need to consider here is that our farmers are in the decline. The average age of a farmer right now is about 57 years old. So many of our farmers are approaching retirement age. And we are in need of people to continue to fill these farming positions throughout the state. Because as we've already talked about, it's a really important industry for the state, and we have the perfect weather for us to be able to do that here. So going back to this definition of agriculture real quick, I want to highlight the very bottom here. In varying degrees, the preparation and marketing of the resulting products. So someone had mentioned it when I asked people to type into the chat what they think of when they think of agriculture. They think of groceries. So yeah, our food eventually makes it to the market and we buy it at grocery stores. So our groceries are the food that we take home with us. We prepare it ourselves, we eat it. But that really is an important thing to think about in the definition of agriculture. It's not just about the farming. There's a lot more to agriculture, and it really goes around our food system and how our food makes it from that farm to our table. So what does that system look like? I am going to go through the system here with you guys today. And really, it starts kind of with our seeding and breeding. It leads to planting and cultivation, what we think of as our typical farming or in the field work. And then we have harvest and storage before this food is eventually distributed and then transported to the markets. The markets are where the sales go on, and also we have to think about marketing, and then eventually it makes it to your plate. So when we think about the food system and we think about agriculture in general, we want to think about sustainability. And why do I bring up this topic of sustainability? Sustainability over the years has come to mean a lot of different things. And to some people, they might think of the definition of sustainability a little bit differently. But for the purposes of our food system and of agriculture, we like to think of it as the 3 Ps. We have profit, people, and the planet. So in order for agriculture to be sustainable, our farmers have to make a profit. If they can't make a living off of what they are doing, then it is not a sustainable industry. So that's really important. We also think about the planet. So over the years, we've seen there are problems with our environment. Not all of them are caused by agriculture. There are some problems with agriculture that we have seen in recent years, but we have to consider the planet as a very important aspect of the agricultural system. And so doing things to protect the planet while we are continuing to feed our population is very important. Then we also think about people. So in sustainability, we think about the social aspect of agriculture and how that interfaces with the community. So these are all really, really important. And for the long-term success of agriculture, especially our local industries here in Florida and Seminole County, we have to continue to think about these three items. And we'll talk a little bit along our journey here today to talk food systems, to talk agriculture, about where sustainability fills in to this system. So like we already kind of talked about when I asked you to put into the Q&A section what your thoughts on agriculture were, a lot of times people think of agriculture just in the field. They think of that farming, they think of harvesting, seeding, sowing, tractors. That's a lot of times the things that they think about. But they forget that this system extends beyond that, because the food doesn't just magically get to us as the consumer. There are a lot of other steps that go on in this, and it's something for every farmer that they have to consider each of these steps along the process. So there's a lot of work that goes into it, and when we go back to that definition of agriculture being a science, being an art, and a practice, it truly is. It is an art. It takes a lot of complex things working together to make a farm work and make that food get to the market the way we see it on our end as the consumer. So now I'm going to walk you through the food system, highlighting some important things that a lot of people talk about with food systems. So first and foremost, I mentioned seeding and breeding as being one of those first stages in agriculture. So this is the start of food production. It's where our plants come from that eventually become the food that we harvest. As many of you may know, especially if you've done any kind of gardening, seeds are often where we start. So with that seed, we can grow a plant, and with that plant, that might produce a flower that turns into a fruit or vegetable, or it might produce another structure like a root or a tuber that we eventually harvest to eat. Not all of our food is propagated by seed. Some of it is, some of it is not. There's other ways to get our food and to make those plants that produce our food through like cuttings, graftings, and other things. But just to kind of simplify it, we're thinking about seeds, we're thinking about plant breeding. And what do I mean by plant breeding? Well, in the wild, our plants started out looking very, very differently than what we know them today. So here's a pretty interesting picture here. This is what wild corn looked like. So as you can imagine, that is nothing like we know as corn on the cob today. So this produces very few corn kernels, and it's not full of nutrients. It's not full of flavor the way that we see corn today. So how did we make it here to this modern corn? Well, that has a lot to do with plant breeding. And traditionally, this happened over time, where breeders picked plants that had qualities that they really liked, and then they kept breeding them. Similarly, the way we do with dogs today, where you see all sorts of different breeds of dogs coming up. The same was happening with plants over time. And our modern idea of agriculture stems from a long history of playing with plants. So what did our plant breeders look for? They were looking for taste. They were looking for texture. They were looking for that color, that sugar, that deliciousness, sometimes the nutritious value of something. But from an agriculture perspective, the breeders were also looking for other things. They were looking for shelf life. How long after it is harvested can we keep it on the shelf and sell to the consumer? How long does it have until it needs to be eaten? They were looking for things like disease resistance. So we'll talk about what plants, what kind of issues happen with plants. And one of them are diseases. Just like we get sick, our plants can also get sick. So the breeders were selecting for resistance to these sicknesses so that the plants grow better, they produce more of our food, and it takes less management on the part of the farmer to produce them. They also thought about yields. So the number, for example, of corn that they got from planting that 1 acre of corn. So they were looking for how many fruit came out of it. They were looking for high quality fruit. And then also other things like the competition against weeds. What other management factors were they looking for? Basically, like I said, how this happened was if they happened to be looking at a ton of plants and tried all these different corn on the cob, and they found one that just tasted a little bit sweeter than the others, they might start breeding that plant with other plants to produce more of that sweet corn in the long run. So they were looking at those specific qualities. And to take a look at what that meant in a little bit more simplified of a model, it's like if we had a bunch of different plants and we saw that some of them were extra tall, we would start breeding these extra tall ones. So over time, our population is a lot of tall plants. So basically, we don't want these short ones for one reason or another. Maybe it's the consumer doesn't like the shorter plants as much. So we selected these taller ones. We kept breeding them so that their babies, their future populations were a lot taller. But like I mentioned, this does take a lot of time. One of the very early techniques for getting this to work was actually to speed up this mutation process. And so, for example, we have some short plants, we have some tall plants, and these tall plants might be a product of just some unique mutation in the genes. So mutations are natural. They happen, and they can be good, they can be bad. Sometimes a mutation might mean the plant won't survive. Other times the mutation might, for example, mean the plant is extra tall. So early on, when they were doing a lot of our traditional plant breeding, they would expose the plants to something that caused mutations. So for example, like something radioactive. And so this plant was exposed to this radioactive agent, and then all of the subsequent seeds that came may have had some kind of mutation. So they would plant those seeds and then look to see if they found anything they liked. And then they would then take the ones they liked and continue to breed them until we reach the crops we really like here today. So a great example with all of this is apples. So in the grocery store, if you go and look for an apple, you'll see there are so many different kinds of apples, all sorts of different colors, all sorts of different textures, flavors, sweet, sour, and this is all a product of breeding. And so it might be a consumer perspective, they like sour apples versus they like sweet apples. So we have both on the market, or it might be a factor of this one grows really well under certain conditions. And so we can grow it really well because it is a stronger variety for where it's being grown. And so that's just an insight into traditional breeding. And the reason I want to bring all of this up is because we've seen a lot of changes in the technology with breeding plants in recent years. So that brings me to the topic of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. And I just want to present to you some interesting information on these, though I want you to do your own research and your own background investigating on genetically modified organisms before you form an opinion on them. This is just some information I want to present to you on this. So genetically modified organisms are basically another way to breed plants. So this is a more streamlined way to select those desirable traits. Like what we saw with traditional plant breeding, it takes a lot of time. So this genetically modified organism might take less time to identify exactly what we want to change about the plant. So we might be able to go in and say that, for example, we really like that this plant survives this sickness when it is planted. So this pathogen that could potentially kill off the plant for the farmer. And we can go in and target that specifically with genetically modifying the organism and change that to best suit the needs of the grower or to best suit the desires of the consumer. Like I said, this takes a little bit less time than traditional plant breeding, though there still is a lot of research that goes behind genetically modified organisms. And just to kind of give you a definition on what a genetically modified organism is it's in some way modifying that genetic makeup of an organism. And to do that, it has to be alive. So when we talk about food labels a little bit later in the presentation today, we will mention the label non-GMO. And if something has a non-GMO label on it, you should probably think about it. For example, if you see a non-GMO label on some water, that doesn't really mean much because water's not living. It's not possible for it to be a GMO in the first place. So I see a question in the chat already. Would GMOs food affect human health in the long run? So this is a question that is constantly coming up surrounding GMOs, and there is a lot of public controversy surrounding this question. So the current statement that we have is there is evidence, scientific evidence, that supports the safe use of genetically modified organisms. But again, I go back to challenge you to do your own research on genetically modified organisms to make that determination for yourself. One of the things with GMOs, I have a couple common GMOs that are listed here on the slide. So corn, soybeans, papaya, cotton, potatoes, sugar beets, those a lot of times have GMOs, and there's usually a reason for why they're genetically modified. Sometimes it goes back to the farm perspective. If we have a pathogen, a disease that affects a crop, we might be able to genetically modify it to do better in the management on the farm. So rather than applying a pesticide, this GMO might naturally defend against that pest or that pathogen so that we don't need to apply as much pesticide to get rid of the problem to grow that crop. So it might be, like I mentioned, the GMO is to defend, combat against pests and pathogens, or it might be something else. And we'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, but I do want to mention papaya here because this is a true success story with genetically modified organisms. So in Hawaii, where a lot of the papaya is produced, there was a terrible virus that has basically caused a lot of problems in the production of papaya, making it nearly impossible for papaya to be a profitable farming industry for the producers. And there's no cure, there's no treatment for this viral pathogen, and it's papaya ring spot virus. And the genetically modified papaya is resistant to papaya ring spot virus. So this is something that scientists went in a laboratory and specifically using genetic modifications bred for a resistant papaya variety. And this really attributed to saving the papaya industry in Hawaii because it just wouldn't be possible for us to get papayas without this GMO. So just one success story there. And another example I will add here is GMOs can also be used in the biofortification of crops. So an example that was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 2018 is golden rice. So this was a rice crop that specifically was modified to contain vitamin A. And the reason for this is because in many developing parts of the world, there are problems with limited nutritional resources, especially when it comes to certain vitamins like vitamin A. So it was leading to problems like childhood blindness because the kids were not getting enough nutrients. And so this golden rice is an example of the use of a GMO to incorporate vitamins into something that wouldn't necessarily have as much of that vitamin, even though it is a very strong food crop. It's very prevalent in many diets throughout the world. So just another example of how genetically modified organisms have been used and are still on the market today. And just to kind of explain GMOs a little bit more, I do want to take the example of corn and look at it a little bit more in depth. And so corn is a very common genetically modified organism, and that's because it is in combination with a gene that is naturally found in the environment. So all of us, all living things have genes. And so a non-GMO corn was basically taken and we inserted a specific gene that made it better at surviving pests. So caterpillars are a terrible pest in corn. A lot of management goes annually just to preventing caterpillars from completely defoliating our corn crops. If the plants are defoliated, we don't get corn out of them because they need those leaves to produce sugars and to grow. And so this bacteria that's naturally occurring in our soil has a protein in it that kills off this caterpillar. So it's called the cry protein, and it's in the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis. And Bacillus thuringiensis is commonly used as a spray, as a pesticide. So we'll spray our plants with Bacillus thuringiensis in order to kill the caterpillar pests that are eating them. So what the scientists did is they identified that gene that made the cry protein in the bacteria. And they inserted that gene in a very simplified way that I'm explaining this into our non-GMO corn. So now we have a corn that has that BT gene in it. It produces the toxin that kills off the caterpillar without having to apply that as a pesticide. So it's naturally occurring in the plant. It kills off the caterpillar, and then we are still able to harvest our corn. So that's just a really simplified way of describing genetically modified organisms, with one where we use that toxin, that BT gene. So that toxin that's produced by that gene, we use it as a pesticide already. But scientists were able to figure out how to integrate it into the genes, into the DNA of that plant, so that we're not spraying it and it's just naturally occurring in the plant. Right? So again, I will talk a little bit more about GMOs later in the presentation, but this is just to kind of give you an overview and encourage you to do your own research on GMOs as well. So moving along in our food system, let's bring it to planting and cultivation. So I've kind of alluded to some of this already, but what do plants need to grow? Just so we're all on the same page with this, we're going to cover this real quickly. So plants need carbon dioxide, so they need air. They need water, H2O. They need light, which is where they get their energy. And then they also need soil. But really what they get out of the soil is a place to hang out as well as nutrients. So really nutrients is what's important coming from that soil. Plants do a really, really cool thing called photosynthesis. And I know that sounds kind of like a big word. Some of you may be familiar and remember way back from your classes, your early, like middle and high school science classes. But basically what photosynthesis is plants take light energy, they take carbon dioxide from the air, and they take water to make sugar and then release oxygen. So they are essentially eating light. They're eating that light and turning it into something that we can eat ourselves, but something that the plant uses to grow and to produce leaves, to produce flowers, to produce fruit, which, like I said, we eat ourselves. But thinking about the resources that plants need to grow, we have to talk about the importance of these resources and protecting them, because many of them are very limited. I do want to bring up the topic of water conservation and protection because it's extremely important in terms of agriculture and our food systems. Water is limited. It really is. It's a non-renewable resource, so there's only so much of it, and what's really critical is there's only so much of it that is clean and usable for us to consume, to grow our plants with, and to use in a household setting. So that limited water that's available can become polluted really easily. So you may think that, well, it seems like most of the world is made of water. We have so many oceans, but only about 1% of that is fresh water. So it's a really limited amount that we can actually use for growing crops and for drinking ourselves. And another really important aspect of that is the population is continuing to grow. So though population growth has slowed down a little in recent years, it's still growing at an exponential rate. So with that growth, we're also seeing more people that need water to survive. So that demand for water is continuing to increase. So with that high global demand for water, it has really become a tug of war between the homeowners, the farmers, and all of the other entities that use water. And I want to bring this up because farming takes a lot of water. You may not realize it, but one watermelon took 310 gallons of water to produce. So you may think that, oh, it's just a watermelon, it might take a couple gallons of water. No, it's really water intensive. A single cup of coffee, when you put it in your coffee maker, that just takes 1 cup of water. But in order to grow that coffee, it took 592 cups of water. Same thing with a glass of orange juice. 1 glass of orange juice is 56 gallons of water. So our agricultural produce, our commodities, even our livestock, they use water. So to get our food, we are using a lot of water. And I want to bring up this graphic here to kind of highlight the water demands in Florida and the projections for the future. So on the day-to-day, our average water use in Florida is about 800 millions of gallons per day. So that's a lot of water right off the bat. With population growth, with people moving to Florida, as well as just people having babies, more people in the state, our projected need in 2035 is an additional 300 millions of gallons per day, in addition to this already 800 millions of gallons per day. Looking at the current water we have available, our underground water sources, as well as the water we have in the aquifers, surface water, stuff like that, we can make available 50 million gallons per day. So that means we have a deficit of still 250 million of gallons of water per day. So just looking at this at the graphic here, we're currently here at the 800 millions of gallons per day. We can make another 50 million gallons per day available, but we still lack that 250. So that's really eye-opening in that we need to change our behaviors. We need to conserve water and protect the water that's out there from contamination because it is so critical to our food supply. Without this water, we're unable to produce our crops. We're unable to have to grow livestock and have them develop so that we have food ourselves. So really important thing to think about in terms of water conservation, because a lot of people are using water to water their lawns. They're using water to wash dishes, to take really long showers, and to clean the house, things like that. And the demand is continuing to rise, and we aren't able to meet that demand in the future. So something to think about if you're interested in conserving water resources, which you should be if you care about your food sources. We also mentioned plant growing requirements that plants need basically space. They need soil and they need nutrients. And space is really critical for that because not just having a location to plant plants is important. We also need to think about, is that area fertile? Will it support plants? Does it have the nutrients that we need to grow our plants? So that brings us to the topic of urbanization and conversion of farmland, which has been a critical issue in recent years. We have a growing population. More and more people are moving to these urban areas, so they're growing, they're getting bigger and sprawling out. But these urban centers are also growing into what was once farmland. And the value of these lands are increasing because people want to build houses there. So based on a very recent study with the USDA Farm and Farmland Report, so this was in 2019, the number of farms declined by 5,800 farms just in 1 year between 2018 and 2019. So that decreased the amount of farmlands in the US by 2,100,000 acres. So that is over, to put this in a number, because I'm not good with acres, to put this in a number that makes sense to most people, that's over 1.5 million football fields worth of farmland that was converted to an urban area or used for another purpose. Yet, our population still continued to grow in this amount of time. So we have less farmland to produce the food, but our population still grew by about 0.5%, or next to 1.5 million people. So an important change to think about when we're talking about our land and our land use, that farmland is incredibly important to our food system, and yet we need to do a better job of protecting the existing farmland that is out there. And it looks like I have a question here. Is reclaimed water part of this water usage per day? So I'm not sure about that, if reclaimed water was included in this water graphic here. There are some issues with reclaimed water in terms of growing plants, though. I will mention this, that reclaimed water does include a lot of salts and other nutrients in it that can be toxic for plants, which means it's not suitable for the production of agricultural commodities. We've seen people use the reclaimed water on these agricultural commodities and end up doing some real damage to their plants. So yes, it's a way of recycling water, but it's only really usable in certain locations, and it's difficult to use it in terms of food production, because there could be other contaminants that we worry about for food safety as well. All right, so what else can go wrong with plants? We've already talked about quite a few things that can go wrong with plants, but I do just want to reiterate that we can have pests like insects, mites. We can have pathogens like bacteria, fungi, viruses. We have weeds, and then we also have a bunch of other stuff like natural disasters, equipment failures, and more. Here in Florida, I have to mention it, we have a very serious problem with our plants, and it is hurricane season every year, where farmers can lose a lot of their crop just to natural disasters associated with the hurricanes that we see very frequently in the state of Florida. Then another one that we also see, we have a lot of lightning in Florida, and we'll get called out into the field where there is just this massive destruction in one part of the field. And so we lost a bunch of food crops there, and it happened to just be a lightning strike. So there's a lot that can go wrong with plants, a lot of things that the grower can control. So for our pests, pathogens, and weeds, they have to enact management, but then there's other things that they can't control, that are just beyond their control, and they just have to hope for a good farming year. So when I talk about pests and pathogens, I want to bring up another super controversial topic, because that seems to be what I do. We have to talk about organic versus non-organic. So organic farming is just one approach to managing a farm. So when we mention all the things that can go wrong with farming, all the things that can go wrong with our plants, farmers have to decide what to do to combat what's going wrong. So for our pests, they might use integrated pest management strategies. So for example, they might mulch to prevent the weeds from sprouting up. Or alternatively, they might also use some kind of pesticide to help control that pest that is causing a problem in the farming system. A common misconception that I do want to talk about is just because something is organic does not mean that it is pesticide free. There are organically labeled pesticides that can be used in organic farming. And I have a picture here of a flower. This is actually a chrysanthemum. And the reason I bring up this example is because chrysanthemums have a very unique chemical inside of them called pyrethrum, or pyrethrin. And so this pyrethrin is a naturally occurring pesticide that kills off some of our insect pests. And so in organic farming, we use this pyrethrin and spray our pests so that it kills them. It's a naturally occurring pesticide, like I said, that can be used in organic farming. On the other hand, we have a version of pyrethrin called pyrethroids, and these were made in a laboratory. So they were based off of this original compound of pyrethrin that was found in this flower, chrysanthemum, and they modified it a little bit to last a little bit longer and to do the job of controlling pests a little bit better. And so this pyrethroid is a pesticide very, very similar to the one we see in organic production, but we use it in conventional production. And because it was made synthetically, it was created in a laboratory, we see that in conventional production and not in our organic production. And you'll see this organic label here. This is a certification with the USDA. that basically you can get certified as an organic operation. We'll talk more about this when we get into the topic of labeling, but I do just want to mention organic here because it is a part of the production. It's an approach to managing the farm and the problems on the farm. But organic production in Florida is very, very difficult. The climate is wonderful for producing plants in Florida, but it's also the perfect climate for a lot of pests and pathogens, and they're able to thrive all year long. So up north, they have a nice freeze in the winter that wipes off their crops, it wipes off the pests, it wipes off the pathogens, and then they start again the following year. They plant new crops and the pests move in at a much slower rate. But here in Florida, a lot of them can survive all year long because we don't have that hard freeze. So those that are involved in organic farming in Florida just they always tell me that it's so difficult and they need to remind people just how difficult it is. So something to consider, and we'll talk more about this when we talk labeling. So also in the food system, we talk harvest and storage. Like I said, the food doesn't magically appear from the farm onto your plate. There's a lot that goes through on the way to getting the product to the consumer. So there's been a lot of really cool technology that has allowed for many harvesting equipment and stuff to be done mechanically, but there is still a very strong need for labor in agriculture to be able to hand harvest a lot of our agricultural commodities. So when we think about harvest and storage, we do need to think about labor laws. We need to think about migrant workers and people who are involved in farming. And there's a lot of other issues surrounding this that I won't get into today, but just one other aspect of agriculture and our food system that you should remember. Then talking storage, people sometimes expect to find all the agricultural goods that they want all year long. So they want to see in the dead of the winter that they have wonderful tomatoes, wonderful strawberries that don't grow really well in cold climates. So there are seasons. Even in Florida, though we have very mild winters, you do see seasonal changes. So it's colder in part of the years and warmer in others. For example, it gets really, really hot in the middle of the summer, and stuff like cabbage isn't going to grow well when it's that hot. So in the spring, we might have different things available. And some agricultural products store way better than others. Strawberries do not store well. You need to eat those strawberries pretty quick, and they don't travel as far as, say, for an example, apples. Apples can be stored for a really long period of time. So just some inner workings of the magic behind food systems and where our food comes from when it comes to harvest and storage. Also on that list, we think distribution and transportation. Like I said, they don't magically appear on the shelves in the grocery store. The grower themselves a lot of times have to specifically think about who they're selling to. Are they selling to someone who's going to sell it at a market for them? For example, are they selling their product to a grocery store that then sells their product to the consumer? Or are they selling direct to the consumer? Can you go to the farmer's market and actually buy directly from your farmer? This has really changed in recent years, and the food distribution network is global. We have seen food moving all across the world. At one point in time, food stayed pretty local, so you couldn't be that far from a farm if you wanted to eat. But now we have all this new technology and globalization that we can get food from halfway across the world in what seems like a blink of the eye. So really, really cool way we have changed our food system, but it also leads for more problems. We're moving agricultural products around the globe. So we could also be moving pests and pathogens with that. And that brings us to the topic of invasive species. So it's a whole nother aspect when we think about distribution of agricultural products. When we're moving something from point A to point B, could we potentially be causing problems at point B for our farmers that are located there? It's a really complex network that is hard to navigate in that sense, because we want to make sure that the product doesn't get stuck at the farm, that it actually gets sold and not wasted in the long run. So lastly here, before I talk about our plate, that brings us to market and sales. And it goes back to the farmer to deciding what kind of market they want. Do they want to sell directly to the consumer, directly to you, or sell to someone else that handles that all for them? And an important logo that you should remember, and we'll talk more about in our class and our webinar series, is the Fresh from Florida logo. This is on commodities that are local here, grown in Florida, and you might start noticing this symbol in the grocery stores now, but it gives you a good indication of, hey, this was grown right here, so you're supporting the local economy by buying this, and also knowing it didn't have to travel super far to reach the store, to reach your hands. That brings me to another extra fun topic in agriculture. What is the deal with all this food labeling? I think nowadays we see so many different labels on food, and most of the time we don't know what they all mean. So for example, we talked about the USDA organic label already, and we talked about that Fresh from Florida label. We'll, in the next slide, talk more about the USDA organic label, but really what the USDA organic label is a certification for farms that produce over $5,000 worth of product every year. They're able to get certified to have this on the label, and they have a really long list of stringent requirements that they have to follow to be considered that organic operation. A really new label that you may have never seen before, it just started rolling out in this last year, is the bioengineered label. This is another USDA program. So this was actually approved in 2018, and mandatory compliance is rolling out in 2022. So you will see a lot more of this label in the next year or so as people are starting to add them to their products. But what this label is telling you is that the product contains some kind of bioengineered technology. So this goes back to our idea of genetically modified organisms. So if it has this bioengineered label, it could be produced using a genetically modified organism. This also brings me to some other labels that we see in the grocery store. So on the contrary to the bioengineered label, you have a label such as the non-GMO product or project. You might see whole grain labels or just non-GMO labeled on there, 100% all natural, cage-free, grass-fed. There's all sorts of different labels out there. And an important thing to know is just do your research on the labels before you trust them. That's something that I will recommend to all of you. Some of these are by organizations that they will charge for you to basically undergo a certification to have that label on your product. But there is a little bit of difference in these types of certifications versus the ones that are coming out of the government organizations. So just keep that in mind. So for example, the non-GMO project is one where I've seen this label on water. And I mentioned it before that water is not alive, so it cannot possibly be a genetically modified organism. And there are a lot of labels out there that have led to confusion on this consumer end. It's hard to understand what they mean, and sometimes you think if you see it, then the ones that don't have it must be bad for me. But really go back to doing your own homework on these things so that you have a good idea of what to look for when you're in the store yourself. And another good example that I provide here is the gluten-free label that has started to pop up on food really recently. So people are now starting to think, oh my gosh, gluten must be bad for me. And that's not necessarily the case. So gluten is in certain crops. So for example, wheat is one that contains gluten. And if someone is allergic to this wheat, so people who have celiac disease might be allergic to some capacity to that gluten, then they should avoid foods that contain gluten. So this gluten-free label was made basically to help people in identifying what foods are good for their specific diet. So there's a lot of different food labels out there is really what I'm getting at here, and they mean different things. So don't just think because you see one of these labels, it's good or bad for me either way. do your own homework on it, and we can definitely talk a lot on labels, but I just wanted to highlight a little bit about that. So really looking at that organic label a little bit more critically, there are a couple different types of organic labels. This stamp of USDA organic is really the certified organic one. So this might be 100% organic, or it might just say organic. So if it's 100%, all of the ingredients and processing aids are organic. There's no GMOs, and it requires that certification. Organic just means 95% of the ingredients are organic. No GMOs. Certification is still required with the USDA. But some other ones made with organic or organic ingredients, they may not necessarily follow all of the same requirements as the 100% organic or organic label. So made with organic still does require a certification, but they do not have this USDA organic seal like our 100% organic or our organic labels. So just so that you're informed on that. Some other questions that we commonly get with organic produce is, does organic taste better? So this is strictly a matter of perception. So there are a lot of different factors that affect flavor in our crops. So this might be personal preference. Some people just like some flavors better. This might be the variety of plant that was planted. We do have some varieties that a lot of organic growers will use, or conventional growers might use. So it might just be a difference in the variety that was planted. Another factor that affects flavor is freshness. So the minute something is harvested, that is when it's freshest, and the sugars start to break down over time. So we think local because our food is traveling a shorter distance when it's staying locally. And so that freshness comes into play when we think about flavor. And then again, time since harvest again. Is organic more nutritional? This is a common question we get surrounding organic produce as well. There is no conclusive scientific evidence that says organic versus conventionally grown produce is more nutritional. This again stems back to those differences in variety, the time since harvest, and really the basic thing is knowing where your food comes from. And if you're buying local, you're able to have that conversation with who's growing the food, or at least someone who's really close to what's happening with that food production, and getting a better understanding of where it's coming from to make informed decisions on what kind of produce you'd like to buy. Ooh, I have a great question in the chat here. Why is organic food more expensive? So there's a couple different reasons for this. We go back to the idea that it's really, really hard to grow fruit and vegetables organically in Florida and just in general. So it requires additional management strategies. So it can be difficult for the farmer to do it. It might cost more for the farmer to produce that fruit. And a lot of times they get lower yields out of what they're growing, so less available. And to some degree, it's a marketing strategy as well. So organic produce, people are willing to pay more for organic in some cases. So that added expense can be from a variety of different factors, and talking to your farmer, getting to know where your food comes from and doing your homework on it can give you a better idea of why specifically what you're buying is more expensive for organic. And then our food system is your plate. That's really where our food eventually ends up. And we have had a better understanding of healthy living than in the past. Today, we have this really incredible technology like our phones just right in our hands where we can do our own homework. We can do our own research without having to spend hours at the library looking through books. So we have the power to make a more informed decision on what we're eating. But you really drive the market for agricultural commodities. Your desires and your purchases are critical to what growers will end up producing and how much they will end up producing. So a good example of this is all of a sudden microgreens have become really, really trendy. And all of the restaurants want microgreens on something on their menu. So really that was a change in what the consumers wanted. And so all of a sudden more people are trying to grow microgreens, more farmers are producing them, or people are trying to grow them at home in their gardens or hydroponically. Another great example is orange juice. During COVID-19, we saw a huge increase in demand for orange juice because of the vitamin C and people wanting to stay healthy and stay healthy in terms of the being healthy for the pandemic and that kind of stuff. So we saw an increase in orange juice demand during that time. And it was a really quick pivot in the market where all of a sudden we, especially here in Florida, where a lot of our oranges go to juicing, we had this huge demand and not enough to supply everything. So really, again, you drive the market. We have also seen in recent years an increased demand for fresh produce, fresh products. Consumers are wanting more fresh veggies and fruits. Whereas in the past, they might have been okay with just canned products or stored products to some degree. So really the market changes as you, as the consumer, change your mind about what your interests are. Does the food always reach your plate? This is something to consider. The answer is no. Unfortunately, it does not. In the US, the average consumer wastes about nearly a pound of food per day. So coming from a 2018 study with the USDA, that is a lot of food loss. So that equates to about 7.7% of all of our cropland just being wasted. So it makes it to the market, it makes it to the consumer, but it's not consumed. So that brings us to some other topics we'll revisit in our webinar series, talking about compost and how to reduce waste. Only purchase what you need. And if you have extras that you don't need, try to find a use for them or compost them so that we're putting those nutrients back into the environment. And so we are trying to lessen our environmental impact and not be wasteful with our food products. So just addressing some current and future challenges in the food system, we talked about resource conservation and land protection. When we talk about water, we talk about the farmland needed to produce our food. We briefly mentioned food waste, how a lot of people in the United States do end up wasting a lot of food, but throughout the world, there's a lot of people going hungry, which we don't want to see either. Climate change is another factor that has made producing our food difficult. We've seen more extreme weather events, we've seen increases in temperature that have really created new challenges for the growers producing our crops. We briefly mentioned invasive pests and pathogens because we're getting new problems. Every year, farmers are seeing new things that they have to combat, and they're harder and harder challenges, making management very difficult. And then also we think the public perception of agriculture in the food system. We want people to be educated on agriculture. And the people are further and further removed from where their food is coming from. There's less people with family connections to farms than historically. So this has been a really cool increase in technology that has allowed for this to be possible, but at the same time, people aren't really informed on what's going on with food production and being able to make those educated decisions on what they want on their plate. And then careers in agriculture and meeting those labor demands are really important for the food system in the future. Like I mentioned before, we need more young people going into agriculture in order to be a sustainable industry, to feed our population, to allow for farming to be a profitable industry while minimizing our impacts on the planet. So what can you do? We've talked a lot about food system, and I hope you have a little bit of an understanding of where our food comes from now. But food is essential, food is everything, and we'll talk more about it in our last webinar of this series. But here are some takeaways in the meantime. Think local, eat local, support your local economy, and get to know where your food is coming from because it's coming from your own area right in our community. Help protect those natural resources and also stay educated, get informed, ask questions. Connect with Extension if you have questions about things, or connect with others in your community that can help answer your questions. And also get involved with the food system in some capacity to better understand what's going on with agriculture here. So one more thing I want to mention, I know we're right at time here. Here in Seminole County, we're going to be doing our virtual farm tours. So if you are curious about what's going on in our county with agriculture, we are highlighting a couple farms with videos this year. So beginning April 26th, we're doing a video scavenger hunt with the chance to win some pretty cool prizes like hydroponic kits, composting buckets, as well as baskets full of local agricultural commodities and other goodies. So stay tuned for that. Follow us on Facebook if you'd like to keep updated with that. And I know we have some questions in the question box. I don't know if I can answer all of them, but I surely will try. I know we have one from the beginning of the class, so I'll start there. Is it better to Sorry, go ahead.
I said I was typing in that one because I wasn't sure I didn't have time. So
it's
on
all
that
right.
one,
we have a couple questions about labels that say non-antibiotics or antibiotic use, hormone-free when it comes to meats and things like that. I can't speak too much about that because I really handle the plant side of agriculture more than anything. But one thing that I can say is I would do your research on these labels and see what they actually mean and see who is putting them on their labels and why. So this could just mean that it's a certain management practice that they changed, or it could just be a little confusing why they're putting it on the label. And it's really specific to the whoever's marketing that product themselves. So I know that's not a really good answer to answer that, but as a plant person, I am not the person to be able to speak on that, but I do want to let you know that those kind of labels exist. And like our plant labeled stuff, there are some interesting things behind the labels that you're going to want to do research on before you trust them. And just understand that there is not a whole lot of regulation with how the labels are used. All right, so will you cover what foods can safely be stored? So I don't have any intention of covering that in any of my talks, and I don't believe that's something that we will cover, but you can always reach out to us through email for more information on this specifically, because there's lots of resources out there through UF-IFAS, and we should be able to point you in the right direction for these resources as well. So yeah, just you'll have our email. We're going to be sending a follow-up email today like we did last time with the presentation as well as the survey for today's class. And you can definitely email us and ask any questions regarding storage of foods and that kind of stuff. And then we have one more question. Will you send out the presentation? Yes, I definitely can. And that way you'll have a little bit of a reference of what we talked about here on the food system today. And I thank you all for joining me. And I'll stay here for a second to see if we have any more questions.
And for next Tuesday's class, if you haven't signed up yet, Tina and I will be going over growing healthily in your gardens here in Seminole County and in Central Florida. So go ahead and sign up for that one if you're available next Tuesday at noon.
Well, I'm excited to see y'all next time. And like I mentioned, we'll be talking more about what you can do when we get to that last webinar and how you can support local agriculture here in Seminole County and beyond.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Alrighty, bye everyone.